welcome and thank you for coming out on such a bitterly cold night. Delighted to see so many of you here. I'm standing in tonight for Dr. Erin Farley, who can't be with us, our president. I'm Steve Connolly, one of the current vice presidents. So we're delighted tonight to welcome Professor Emeritus Rob Duck of the Geosciences at the University of Dundee, who has kindly been a speaker of ours before and part of the Dundee Afternoon Lecture Series, who talked to us about the River Tay, etc. But tonight he's going to talk to us about Dundee's forgotten geologist, James Durham. So Rob, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and yeah, let me also say thanks for turning out on such a chilly night. James Durham, Dundee's forgotten 19th century geologist. I'm hoping that the majority of people in the room have not heard of this man. I first became interested in James Durham years and years and years ago when I heard of something called the James Durham Bursary in the university. That was awarded to a student in physics. And I was also aware of something called the James Durham, or rather the Durham Bequest, which was to support geological research. So I was aware of him. Nobody really knew anything about James Durham. And then came across this reprint, as you can see here, Post-Glacial Beds at Dundee. And if you look at the top, it actually says, with J. Durham's compliments on it. So we have a sample of his handwriting. And then I suppose we got locked down and I started to think about something to do to fill my time in. And I started to get interested in James Durham again and found out a lot about this man, and that's what I'm going to try and tell you tonight. Born in 1840, died in 1905, he was a bachelor. And I'm going to begin tonight's story in Dundee's Western Cemetery. I'm going to start looking at this gravestone. Now right at the top it says John Durham. Now John Durham was the father of James you can see here. John Durham was a very interesting character. He had trained as an artist at the Royal Academy in London. He was a contemporary of Turner, and he came from Edinburgh and ultimately moved to Dundee and set up a shop. He was a stationer and a printer and a publisher. Why he came to Dundee is not absolutely clear, but he came to Dundee and he set up a shop which ended up at number 49 High Street. And I'll show you where that is in a moment. Let's just have a look at this gravestone here, this obituary. His wife was Margaret Ruff. So this is James Durham's mother, Margaret Ruff. Now Margaret Ruff was the sister of George Ruff, the former provost, very famous provost of the city, and the daughter of George Ruff Sr., who was another very famous character in Dundee political circles. James was born in 1905. You can see he had a sister who died aged 5 called Barbara. 2 other sisters here who outlived him, Isabella Jane and Elizabeth Gibson, or Lizzie. He also had another sister and another brother who do not appear on this particular gravestone. James's father, John Durham, was a political activist. He was a radical liberal, many were in Dundee at that time, at that sort of time. And he was even in the 1840s branded, wrongly I would say, as a Chartist. Nonetheless, these radical liberal political views were ones that James was to inherit. You'll see the letters after his name, FRSE, Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and FGS, Fellow of the Geological Society, and I'll mention that again later on. So John Durham comes to Dundee, and he eventually set up a shop at 49 High Street. This is Abertay House, where Boots is today, and his shop is here, almost but not quite in the Overgate, and he has a printing works in this close here, St Salvator's Close. Now when James was 21, he joins his father as a partner in the business, and the business becomes known as John Durham and Son. They were printers, as I say, and they were publishers, and they were also stationers. And here are some of the things that they sold. You could buy fine ink at 2 shillings a gallon, for example, that kind of thing. You could buy finest morning stationery. These are the sorts of products that they had. They published local books like the History of Dundee here by James McLaren in 1874. But they also published what I think one would call rather esoteric works as well. So they weren't just a parochial publisher. Azimuth tables of certain principal fixed stars. And latterly, they developed a niche in the Dundee market of what one would call theatrical publishing. They published programmes and catalogues of theatrical and other works. They also published this booklet here, the Dundee Naturalists Society. This booklet was published when the Dundee Nats became of age, 1874 to 1895. This was their 21st birthday. And you'll see it was published here by J. Durham's son and another named Kinnock, who joined as a partner later on. They published that. And that's hardly surprising, because as I'll show you in a moment, James Durham had a very, very long and important association with the Dundee Nats. The family lived in Union Street in Dundee, but it was a large family, and the accommodation in Union Street was inadequate, so they took the plunge in 1853, when James was 13, to move to Newport, and they lived in this house. This is called Wingate Place. It's actually 2 houses, and they lived in the left-hand house here, and indeed occupied that until all of the family, the unmarried family, had passed away. This opened up a whole new world to the young James. He's come from Dundee. He is 13. He's at the high school. We're pretty sure of that. We don't know for absolute certain, because there are no records. But given that his younger brother, another John, also went to the high school, and given that in later life James donated lots of specimens to the high school, we're pretty certain that he was educated there. But Newport opened up a whole new world to him, because right on his doorstep he had rocks, exposures, lovely exposures of rocks. And I would suggest that in his early life in Newport, this is where he began his interest in geology. It was also very, very, very fashionable in Victorian times to be a geologist or to be a botanist, where one could spend time outside and where one could collect specimens, rocks, minerals, fossils, etc. And right outside James's door, we have here exposures of lavas, and you can see, in fact, individual lava flows, right literally outside his front door. And in the distance, there is, of course, the Tay Railway Bridge. we should remember that at the time the family moved there, the first Tay Railway Bridge had not been built. But John Durham, the father, was actually one of those agitators, very early agitators, for a crossing, a fixed crossing of the Tay, because it was quite an awkward and dangerous and unpredictable commute back and forth between Newport and Dundee, and often it wasn't possible. Which was awkward because he had the business to run in the city. And James Durham studied the local rocks on both sides of the Tay, and he studied them in great detail. He collected many, many specimens, and he is largely a self-taught geologist. And that's not really unusual. That was very common in that day. However, he learned a lot from talking to others and learning from others, as we'll see. He recognized individual lava flows that you can see here in the local rocks between Newport and Tayport, and this actually became his first love, rather than being a printer. The geology of the local area. This is a map I often show when I'm talking about the geology of the local area, but I don't usually explain the history of this map, because this map was published in 1938, so long after James's day, and it was published just prior to the British Association meeting in Dundee in 1939. A meeting, of course, that was had to be cancelled because of the Second World War. This is the area then that James was particularly interested in, the lavas that make up the North Fife Hills, the lavas of the Sidlaws, and these intrusive rocks, which are in this map shown in red, which are emplaced into the brown rocks of the Devonian, or the Old Red Sandstone. That was the terrain that he was interested in. And that map was published specially for this meeting which was abandoned. This is September 1939, looking into City Square, a rather quiet and damp City Square, all ready for the British Association in the first week of September, but of course the Second World War was declared. But that brings me to the British Association meeting of 1867, the first time the British Association met in Dundee. This was a very controversial meeting. It was controversial because Dundee was a town, didn't get its city status until 1899, and it didn't have a university. So it was very unusual for the British Association to meet in a place that didn't have a university. And it was considered really controversial for this meeting to take place. It was a resounding success, a tremendous success, as I'm sure you know. The Albert Institute was built to accommodate many of the lectures. It was a fantastic success on all the great and the good of British science, and in particular British geology, were there. And James Durham was one of the attendees. He was able to hear people like Archibald Geekie, who was a very, very famous geologist. And this, I think, was pivotal. And in 1868, remember, he was born in 1840. He was by now 1867. He was now about 27, something like that. So he was a mature man, a relatively mature man, but he met a lot of people at this meeting. And one of the people he was hoping to meet was a man called Robert Chambers. Now Chambers, this is Chambers of W&R Chambers, the famous publishers of dictionaries. Robert Chambers lived at the time in St Andrews. But he was an old man in 1867 and unwell. And James was hoping to hear him give a talk on something that he'd written about many years earlier in 1848 in his book Ancient Sea Margins as Memorials of Changes in the Relative Level of Sea and Land. But Chambers wasn't there, and his paper was actually given by a man called Henry Woodward. And Henry Woodward was another equally important and famous geologist of the day. Chambers had described various plateaux, this is one in Lucas, and attributed the flat top to a marine erosion surface. Now, he got a bit carried away in this book because he had different levels of the sea all over Britain, and he had in some places 50 levels of the sea recorded and this kind of thing. However, it is an intriguing document. Anyway, here's one of them. Whether this is exactly the one that Chambers illustrated, I'm not certain. But this is one of these plateaux, and this is known as the Straighten Plateau near St Fort in Fife. Now, why was James Durham interested in this particular area? Why was he interested in these deposits? Well, he was interested in them because he had made a friend of a person who I think you may have heard of, a person in connection with the construction of the Tay Railway Bridge. James was a member of what was then called the West Newport Club. Later became the Newport Club. He was a member of the West Newport Club. And there he encountered a man called Albert Grote. Now, Albert Grote was the resident engineer on the Tay Railway Bridge. And Grote was a very ebullient speaker, very, very entertaining speaker. And he talked about his bridge being in construction. Only, of course, when the bridge fell, it was Boucher's bridge that he spoke about. But although James had access to cuttings, to excavations in the sands and gravels of this area near to Newport and St Fort, with the railway being built between Lucas and Wormit, Grote gave him access to new exposures of these materials. And James Durham was obviously very intrigued by these deposits, not only by the deposits of sands and gravels, but also by the landforms of this area. Now, this is a modern map of the area. It extends from at the top of the slide, Wormit, through the Wormit Gap to Lucas. And trending all the way through it, as you can see here, is the railway line. Okay? So there were lots and lots of excavations that were being made while this was being built to connect up with the Tay Railway Bridge. Now, it's a complicated area of superficial deposits that comprises those plateaus, like the one that Chambers had written about. We see what are called eskers, which are long, narrow ridges of sands and gravels. They look a bit like railway embankments. And what we today call kames, which are sort of like knobs or mounds of sand and gravel. And we also see depressions, these dark areas, which we call kettle holes. And in that day, there was no systematic nomenclature at all for these landforms. So the term esker and kame were used interchangeably, and they were spelled in different ways. There was no systematic spelling either. But James had explored this area very carefully, and as a result, he became very interested in it. We call this, this is Wormit, this is the Wormit Gap, as it is called. The Wormit Gap is this gap in exposures then between lavas under here, under this field, lavas under where the houses are. It represents then where a branch of the Abertay Glacier had taken a route through this area here and had extended through towards Lucas and the Eden estuary. Through here, and then through this area here. And today, there used to be quite a lot of sand and gravel workings in it, none of them actually active today because of a fall in the market value of the product. But until a few years ago, it was a very active area for sand and gravel. And this area fascinated James Durham, and he was certainly intrigued about the way in which these landforms had been created. This is the golf course at Drummoyne, and at Drummoyne you can see how this hole is actually utilising perfectly these cames, these knobs, to create features in the terrain, utilising the terrain. And at Drummoyne there is a hole, which I'll show you in a moment, which is actually called Kettle Hole. How are these features formed? Well, if we look at this top diagram here, if you imagine an ice mass that's perhaps receding, and we can see here there's water draining on top of the ice, or even in a tunnel within the ice. When that ice melts, you're left with perhaps sinuous ridges of sand and gravel known as eskers, or perhaps as knobs, little mounds known as cames. That diagram was unknown to James Durham. That was unknown to anybody at the time. At the time, the issue was whether those sand and gravels were moraine or were they of glacial origin. That was debatable for a lot of people because theories of glaciation were really in their infancy. So it was a controversial sort of area to be looking at that time. This is Kettle Hole, the 17th at Drummoyne, and there is the Kettle Hole there, as you can see right behind the green. And the Kettle Hole forms where you have a receding glacier, leaves a couple of broken pieces of dead ice behind, and these perhaps become covered over by sand and gravel outwash, and then when the ice finally melts, you're left with depressions which may or may not have water in them. So that's the 17th at Drummoyne. And so, having utilised these exposures, these new exposures afforded by his association with Albert Grote on the Lucas to Wormit stretch of railway, James Durham in 1877 publishes his first paper, and he calls it The Cames, in inverted commas, in the neighbourhood of Newport Fife, NB. It's a bit controversial. NB, of course, North Britain in that. But we won't go into that. And he published it in one of the foremost journals of the day, Geological magazine. The editor of which was none other than Henry Woodward. Henry Woodward, of course, having given the paper that Robert Chambers was unable to do so. And this was his first written paper. He actually had a diagram in it, and this is the diagram here, which just really shows the area that we're talking about. I'm showing it for no other reason than that. And there's the Lucas Railway there, Wormit, the Tay Bridge. And it's quite short, it's interesting, and it's written in the language of the day. Here's some of the now now lost cames in what we would call came and kettle topography. I say now lost because they've largely been worked for sand and gravel. But this is the prose of the day. Standing amongst them, that's these cames, and having no standard by which to estimate their dimensions, one is apt to be carried away with the feeling that he is contemplating one of those scenes of mountain grandeur usually associated with landscapes of far greater magnitude. Cones and ridges seen, hills and mountain chains, little pools seem lakes, and tiny streamlets, rivers, impressing the imagination not very differently from the far vaster features of a highland district. Well, every author's nightmare when you publish your first paper, he got lots and lots of discussions, and they were really quite damning. They were quite hard discussions which were published. What's more, people were still criticising his paper. Until 1883, he had discussion lasting for 6 years, which is quite really quite a long time. And this is what the controversy was. They owe their present forms not to any abnormal action of the elements, he said, but to the result of the same denuding agents that are present in operation. Rain and rivers have shaped them all, and that's his exclamation mark. Okay, he recognised, because there are exotic materials in the gravels that came from the highlands, that ice was involved. He recognised that. He recognised that there had been machinery working to produce those horizontal surfaces, those plateaux, but he believed in denudation, contemporary denudation, the work of wind and rain, principally rain, to produce these forms that you can see here. And that's where it all went wrong. However, before it went wrong, on the basis of this paper, he gets what was a real Victorian badge of honour. He gets his fellowship of the Geological Society of London. And that was a fantastic badge of honour, an FGS. Mr. James Durham, bookseller and publisher, it says, Fellow of the Dundee Naturalist Society, Wingate Place, Newport 5, NB. Okay, note the NB. But Fellow of the Dundee Naturalist Society. Now that was unusual, because as far as I know, the Nats didn't have fellows, so that was just stretching things a little bit. He is recommended by Henry Elaine Nicholson. Now, Henry Elaine Nicholson was then the Professor of Natural History at St Andrews, famous paleontologist. And he got to know Nicholson through the Nats. Good old Henry Woodward appears again, and a man called John Morris, who was a very eminent stratigrapher, and the proposer here, Horace Woodward, who's the nephew of Henry. He gets his FGS in 1877. But there was lots and lots of discussion of his paper, largely from people who thought he was a new kid on the block, really. He hadn't got geographical experience. He hadn't been to lots of other places. And they didn't believe, in particular, in the role of denudation to shape the landforms. And the last discussion was 1883, 6 years later. T.V. Holmes. It seems to me that this view of the production of the contours of an escarpment tract by the agency of rain and rivers may rank with that once commonly held of the marine origin of escarpments as an equally instructive example of what invincible determination on behalf of a favourite agency can effect where zeal is untempered by discretion. Durham writes back 1 month later, this may not be zeal untempered by discretion, to quote Mr. Holmes's elegant phrase, but it seems to me to be a striking example of the unscientific use of the imagination. And he must have been delighted that that was the end of these discussions. Okay, he overplayed the role of denudation, and he didn't know some of the things that we know today about what we call fluvio-glacial deposits and the way in which they are formed. But it was a very, very interesting paper, and a lot of what he wrote was very, very perceptive, because he was able to marry the two processes, marine and glacial, and recognize that they were both involved in these in the formation of these deposits, but he overplays the role of denudation. And so, for his next paper, he turned to something a little less controversial. He had become very familiar with a gentleman called James Geekie, Archibald Geekie's brother. And James Geekie was based in Perth. He was an officer then in the Geological Survey. And he was one of 3 geologists who were mapping this sheet here, which we call sheet 49, which is given the name Arbroath. He was one of 3. And James Geekie was a very, very frequent visitor to the Dundee Nats. And James and one of his colleagues at the Dundee Nats, I'll say more about that later, made an interesting discovery in this area here, which we know, or was known, as the Stannergate Braes. And the Stannergate Braes are now no more, thanks to docklands being developed. And the Stannergate Braes were being developed in the 1870s. And in the 1870s, with a man called Alan Matthewson, and Alan Matthewson was an archaeologist, they discovered an ancient kitchen midden on the Stannergate, which James wrote about, and a series of burial kists with skeletal remains inside, and some interesting pottery, an urn in particular. And Alan Matthewson wrote about those. So, discovery of an ancient kitchen midden near Dundee, also published in the Geological magazine. And he was on much safer ground here, it's very descriptive. And who helps him identify some of the remains in the kitchen midden but Henry L.A. Nicholson from St Andrews. So he's well connected with some of the great and the good at the time. So this great mound of shells is associated with what we used to call the 25-foot raised beach in this area. Alan Matthewson was in fact a former treasurer of the Dundee Nats. Which really brings me to James's long and very, very fruitful association with the Dundee Naturalist Society. And he was associated with it right from the start. He became a council member very, very early on. He became vice president, and in fact served as president for a four-year period. There's a list there. I don't like going through lists, but you can see he spoke on many, many topics. Those in yellow I've mentioned, really. They relate to the full papers that he wrote up in Geological magazine. He travelled, as you can see. He travelled very extensively, not only in Scotland, but also overseas. The geological history of the island of Egg. Notes on 2 volcanoes, Arthur's Seat and Papenkau in the Eifel region of Germany. And I'm going to pick out 1 or 2 other papers that he did and just mention these in terms of the impact that they had. He went to Vesuvius. He went to Sicily. He travelled in the final year, or just the penultimate year of his life, he travelled extensively in North Africa. Mainly, but not entirely, alone. But he seemed to prefer to travel on his own. He went to Egg, though. You can't read this map with Mr. W.N. Walker, FGS, a fellow geologist, William Nish Walker. He was also a member of the Dundee Naturalists Society. William Nish Walker and a fellow geologist. And he wrote this paper up here in the Scottish Naturalist in 1885, The Geology of the Island of Egg. A little simplistic perhaps, but remember it was a long time ago. He spoke about Arthur's Seat, and he made a comparison between the Arthur's Seat volcano, very, very different, much older than this one here at Papton Cowell, which is a dry crater and very, very much younger. Whereas that is essentially Carboniferous in age. This is probably only about 100,000 years old, something like that. In 1886, he gave a talk to the Nats called Seeing Through a Grindstone. And this was a first for Dundee. What on earth is seen through a grindstone? Well, a man called Henry Clifton Sorby from Sheffield had discovered that you could make a thin slice through rock and you could examine it in different forms of light, what we call plane and cross-polarized light. As far as I'm aware, when James Durham spoke to the Nats in 1886 on Seeing Through a Grindstone, this will be the first time that any Dundee audiences would have heard about thin sections or thin slices through rocks. He had his own microscope, we know that. How on earth does he get these thin sections made? There's a bit of speculation here. By this time he'd become very friendly with this man, John Wesley Judd. And John Wesley Judd was the Professor of Geology at the Royal School of Mines at Imperial College. And he'd encountered John Wesley Judd because when he was made a Fellow of the Geological Society of London, Judd was the president. And in that day, in order to receive your fellowship, one had to be present at a meeting in London at the rooms in Burlington House in Piccadilly. And he obviously struck up a very, very strong relationship with Judd, because in many of his subsequent papers, Judd helps him, or he thanks Judd for his assistance. But I'm also going to mention another man who was very influential, William Durham, Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Now, it gets a bit complicated here. William Durham was his cousin. But William Durham had also married one of his sisters. So he became his brother-in-law as well. Okay, you got that? Keep up. He was his cousin and his brother-in-law. He had married the sister who wasn't on the gravestone in the Western Cemetery, called Mary Helen, and they lived in Portobello, where he was a printer and a stationer and an astronomer, and he had his own laboratory. He'd been trained as a chemical analyst, and he maybe also had the means to help James produce thin sections. We know John Judd did, but we're not sure that William Durham did, but perhaps. William Durham actually was, in his own right, a very famous scientist. He was a great popularizer of science, and he had a Saturday article every week in the Scotsman on different aspects of science. And these were all drawn together into a series of books. In 1888, James becomes elected to Fellowship of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And it's interesting to see who his proposers are. James Geekie, who we've heard about, geologist with the Geological Survey, very good friend to the Nats, very good friend to James Durham. And then he uses his cousin. Now, I don't know whether that's allowed today, or his brother-in-law, whichever way you look at it. And I don't know if your brother-in-law is a hierarchical level above your cousin or what. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, Mr. William Durham was described as a chemist, papermaker and astronomer in this citation. And he plugs into Edinburgh Society, Alexander Crumb Brown, famous chemist, and Peter Guthrie Tate, who was a physicist and mathematician. And he's duly elected to Fellowship of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1888. We saw the two sets of letters after his name on the gravestone. He spoke to the Nats in 1894 on notes on some well borings in Dundee. And this was pioneering, absolutely pioneering stuff. Pioneering for Dundee. But, it's interesting, John Wesley Judd had also written about well borings in London. So he obviously got the idea from him. Because he was in business in the city, he was very, very well connected. Extremely well connected. He knew all the great and the good in the city, as had his father. And anybody that was drilling a hole for water, he got the information on what rocks they were passing through and at what depth the groundwater was reached. He was very, very disappointed in the results, because what he'd hoped was he would be able to predict levels at which groundwater could be found. But what that map shows you is the great heterogeneity of the geology beneath Dundee. It's very, very complicated. And as a result, we've got these igneous bodies here, we've got a number of faults. Igneous bodies of different types, given the different colours. We've got rocks with different fracture geometries, and so it's very difficult to predict where you're going to find groundwater in a city like Dundee. The fact that he did this work, it was absolutely pioneering work, is fascinating, but he didn't realise the importance of it, that it's very difficult, nay impossible, to predict groundwater levels in a city like this. It's a pity that this never became published. By this time, though, he had become Dundee's go-to geologist. He was the person that anybody who wanted geological information went to. He amassed a great collection of specimens at this time and a large amount of knowledge. And in 1895, he was elected as the president of what was called the East of Scotland Union of Naturalists Societies, which comprised all of these societies here in the east of Scotland. And you can see vice presidents here, James Geekie, you see there's a pattern emerging, Darcy Thompson, and Darcy Thompson, of course, one of the early professors at University College Dundee. He was very, very friendly with Darcy Thompson, and he learned a lot from Darcy Thompson. There's no doubt about that. But it was quite an honour for him to be elected as the president of this body, the East of Scotland Union of Naturalist Societies. A body that had been instituted, as you can perhaps just see there, in 1884. I'd like to mention another talk that he gave to the Nats, which was an interesting one. In 1899, Note on the Denudation of the Tay Valley. This word denudation that I've used quite a lot, it pervaded through his work. He was always interested in denudation. He saw this kind of thing. This is Birkhill Bank. And he tried to estimate how much material was being derived by erosion in the Tay catchment. Now, others had done this. Archibald Geekie had done this. Archibald Geekie had done this for a river called the Nith in Dumfriesshire. He'd also tried to do it for the Mississippi. But the mistake that James Durham made, essentially, was that an estuary doesn't behave like a river. A river doesn't just receive its sediment from the catchment. it also receives material from the sea, and in the Tay's case, more from the sea than from the river catchment. However, what he said was about 855,000 tonnes of rock, that is in the form of sediment particles, are carried past Dundee to the North Sea every year. Okay, it was miles out, but it doesn't matter. This was absolutely pioneering that he had done this. Again, it was a paper that he gave to the Nats, but he didn't publish it. A couple of papers, though, that he did publish, I do want to spend a few minutes on to finish with. The Volcanic Rocks of North East Fife was published in the Quarterly Journal of the Geological Society of London in 1886. And in fact, what he was doing here was looking at the solid geology of the area where he lived, here, between Newport and Wormit. And he was, in effect, the very first person to recognise or to map this area. He produced a really strange cross-section, because he produced a cross-section as if one was sitting in a boat in Wormit Bay, looking on shore. So west is here, and east is over here. So it's a very curious way to draw it. Nonetheless, that's how he did it. He's got here conglomerate of rounded volcanic stones. And he's got lavas, and he's got sedimentary rocks. What he was doing, and he was the first person to recognise the very intimate association that we have in this area of sedimentary and igneous rocks, and that the sediments are made up of bits of igneous rock, hence conglomerate of rounded volcanic stones. So what he was recognising was that in the Devonian times we had this very, very close association of igneous activity and then formation of sedimentary rocks. And that's his sediment or conglomerate made of rounded volcanic stones, as you can see there, which actually forms the abutments of the Tay Railway Bridge. Then you've got the fine-grained so-called ashy sediments, and here the sediment there interlayered between two igneous formations. And here it's just a sort of squeeze of igneous rock, just a bit like toothpaste almost, between the sedimentary ashy sandstone. So he described this area. He describes thin sections from this area with a lot of help from his friend John Judd, and he produces a really fascinating paper. Inland, one of the areas that he talks about is another place that's sort of lost to the memory, called Gould's Den. And Gould's Den is located between Galdraigh, over the hill, and Kilmeny, from where this photograph is taken. This is a geological map of it here. It's Kilmeny, and that's Gould's Den, and that greenish body there is an intrusion, a dike, a wall of rock that has been emplaced into the country rocks, which are lavas, and that is the Gould's Den here. And one of the locations he wrote about a lot was this. Now, Gould's Den was a really attractive place. You could, until the 1920s, you could buy a railway ticket which allowed you to travel to Wormit from Dundee. You could walk over, see Gould's Den, and pick up a train at Kilmeny and go back to Dundee. You could buy a Rambler's ticket. And even in 1935, the Dundee Nats were going to Gould's Den with Mr. Smith, whoever, I'm afraid I don't know who Mr. Smith was. One of the last papers that he wrote is a real curiosity, and you think it could either be treated as naive or very perceptive. The Ordnance Survey and Geological Faults. It's published in Nature, very, very good journal, which took letters Basically, what he said was, the Ordnance Survey has been around quite a bit. It's going to do a re-survey. Perhaps it might be possible with the surveying methods that the Ordnance Survey have to detect if there's been movement on some of the faults in Scotland. In particular, he talks about what we now call the Highland Boundary Fault, as at Comrie, famous for its earthquakes. Now that seems, well, is that obvious? Is it naive or whatever? 50 years have elapsed. Of course, 50 years is a very minute part of the history of one of these old faults, but if the data of the Ordnance Survey be so accurate, as is usually supposed, some trace of shifting might possibly be discovered if the necessary observations were made. This is just what we do today with modern geodetic surveying techniques in areas of uplift or subsidence, or areas where we have lots of volcanic activity. So, but in 1893, that was, I would say, rather more of a perceptive observation than one that was naive. Now, Durham had always wanted to see geology being taught in Dundee. And it began to be taught in 1903 by a man, a Welshman, called Thomas Jehu. Thomas Jehu was appointed to teach in University College and also the University of St Andrews. And that, as far as I know, is the only picture of him on a field trip from UCD. That's him here with his class. And look, we've got a girl in the class, which is excellent, in 1908. And it was taught just as a first year subject. And Jehu stayed here quite a few years before he ended up actually as Regis Professor of Geology in Edinburgh. Anyway, Durham died in 1905, so he only just saw geology start to be taught. And in 1905, he left all his specimens, or many of his specimens, to University College. And this is actually the receipt for the materials that he left. And you can see that he left his slides of rocks for the microscope, his cabinet with drawers and rock specimens therein, fossils, minerals, rocks, etc. in the cabinet in his smoking room, and for British petrography by Teal, the foremost British petrographer, in 2 volumes, half Morocco bound. So it's very specific, which will be bequeathed to University College under the testamentary writings of the said deceased James Durham. And these were received with great thanks because Jehu didn't have a lot of specimens here at all. And Jehu was absolutely delighted with the materials that were left. It's interesting though that 3 people signed the receipt here. There's Arnold Watterson, who was the Secretary and Treasurer of University College, David Watson, who's the UCD telephonist, but, and there's another whole story here, S. James Shand, BSc, from Balgillo Crescent. Samuel James Shand was to become, he was just a student, why he signed it I don't know, he was just a student, but he was to become one of the foremost professors of geology of his day, and indeed he was, because he obviously got a first look at these specimens, he was actually to write some papers on some of the materials that James Durham had collected. Durham also left £500 to establish the first bursary that I mentioned, the James Durham Bursary. There was a condition in the will, and the condition in the will was that this wouldn't be paid to UCD until the last of his surviving sisters passed away. Little did he know that Lizzie would outlive him for another 40 years. And she didn't pass away, in fact, until 1945. And the James Durham Bursary was then established, and it was to be £15 for final honours student in physical sciences. But let's just look at what that meant. In today's money, he left £500 in 1905. That would have been worth equivalent to about 62,000 today. But that had reduced in value in 1945 to about 23,000. Nonetheless, it was still quite a large amount of money. So that was the first bequest. The second was the bequest that was made by his two sisters, Isabella and Lizzie. They were very, very, very fond of their brother, and they understood that the love of his life was geology. And the terms of their wills were also to leave money in his memory in order to underpin geological research in UCD. Well, of course, UCD, by the time they passed away, or by the time the terms of the will came to be, UCD had actually become Queen's College. Because there was another hiccup here. They had a life rentrix, and their life rentrix was their niece. And their niece didn't pass away until 1960. And so, in 1960, Miss Isabella J. Durham's trust left 3,600, and her sister, Elizabeth, leaves 4,200. So again, a very substantial amount is left to then Queen's College, Dundee. And this really was extremely helpful to the department, to the relatively young department of geology, enabling to put research funding on a much more firm financial footing. And I suppose that's really my story of some of the nuggets of James Durham. Why is he forgotten? He was a very quiet man. He was tied in with all the great and the good, but he was an amateur. He didn't have the formal qualifications that the new UCD professoriate had. They all dined at his house, we know that. He was a humble man, and I think it gave him great pleasure that he was able to dine with these people. He was at heart an academic, but he didn't have the qualifications, if you like, to become an academic. That's the story, then, really, of this man. Well-known geologist, and he was a well-known geologist. Mr. James Durham of the firm of John Durham & Son Wholesale Stations and Printers died at his residence, Wingate Place, Newport, last night. The intimation of the sad event will cause a shock to his many friends in the city and district. He died of cancer of the esophagus in 1905. And I think he requires a little bit more memory, a little bit more recognition than perhaps he's had. Thank you very much, folks.